Maybe that's better.
I think that's better.
Ah, right.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are now. This is my techie here.
Excellent.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah. Oh, I didn't click on join with computer audio. That was the problem, evidently.
Yeah, I had the same problem. So we're here now and you can hear me. So,
yeah.
Professor Crystal, first of all, it's nice to see you.
And you.
Yeah, how's the weather in Holyhead today?
It's beautiful today. Yeah, absolutely lovely here. Where are you at the moment?
I live in Helvoetsluis. That's very near. Well, it's near Rotterdam.
Oh right, yeah.
Sure, it's about 30 kilometers from Rotterdam. So it's just the south of the Netherlands.
Yeah, right.
So
yeah. We know. I know your part of the world quite well.
You do, yeah. So before we start, just this. What's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of the Netherlands?
Well, my daughter, who lives in Amsterdam.
Oh, does she?
Has done for 30 years.
Oh, wow.
So you know, we have been regularly to Amsterdam for that time. So at one point we stayed there for 3 months.
All right, so you're quite familiar with Dutch language and culture as well.
Oh, absolutely. I can ask for an apple flap as good as anybody in the world. Yeah. And we also know Rotterdam because an organization that I used to work with was based there. So, you know, we know that area.
Nice. Well, those are, I think, the two most beautiful cities in the Netherlands. Amsterdam is beautiful and Rotterdam is a whole different ballgame, but it's beautiful as well.
Yeah.
Different manner. It's really a metropolitan city, and Amsterdam is really the old-fashioned Holland, the way it used to be, you know, centuries ago. Yeah.
yeah, true, right. So yes, it's nice to be able to talk to you about these things.
Yeah, well, let me, because I'm doing this interview not only just for me, but for my students and for my readers and for my followers as well, for my viewers. And let me just, I'll tell you the purpose of the interview again, just for the people listening to this interview. I wrote you a letter because, I teach English in high school, and most of my students are pretty fluent in American English. They emerge in American culture on a daily basis. They play games, they listen to American music, they are Netflixing all day long as much as they can.
Yeah, so, same in Britain, no difference.
Yes. So there's only one problem. As soon as it comes to assessing students, we tend to assess them in RP, British English. Why? I don't know. And I know for a fact that many of my students struggle with RP, mainly because of RP doesn't pronounce the R as the Americans do. So we talk about brother and better and a sister, things that come natural for the English speaker, but for American English, that's a whole different ballgame. So I would like to address this topic. I would like to discuss this topic with you. I would like to talk about it and just try to find out why and how we decide which accent should be dominant, which accent is most important, and why. So that's the topic of today. I'm trying to figure out why we do things the way we do. And today I thought of a sentence from Orwell's book, Animal Farm. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. Do you think we can replace the word animal by Englishes?
Yes, most certainly you can. All Englishes are equal, but some are more equal than others, because socially and historically, that's the reason. So we have to, I think, make sure that we focus on accent today, rather than the broader topic of dialect and varieties of English generally, because although ultimately it's the same sort of thing, remember the difference. Accent is a matter of pronunciation. Dialect involves grammar and vocabulary as well. So when we talk about British English versus American English, we're talking about British English vocabulary, British English grammar, as well as British English pronunciation. Now, to talk about all of that would be enormous, but so let's focus just on the accent side, Timon, yes?
Yes, yeah, let's do so. So we're not going to talk about Welsh and Scottish and Irish. No, it's more about the way we pronounce standard English, American English versus RP, for example.
Yeah, well, you need to know a little bit about the history of all of this. RP, received pronunciation, is an accent that came into being round about the year 1800 or thereabouts. You know, it takes a while for an accent to become established. And when it evolved, it was very much an elitist accent. It was the accent of the upper classes in England. Notice, not in Britain. We're not talking about Scotland and Wales and Ireland. We're talking about England. And it was the accent of the royal family, the accent of the institutionalized church, the accent of the best universities, and so on. It was always a minority accent, never spoken by more than about, say, 5% or so of the population of England. But it became the prestige accent. In other words, if you wanted to get on in society, if you didn't have that accent, it was likely to hold you back. Mm-hmm. And the way the 19th century evolved was that that accent became the accent associated with the public schools. The public schools trained the colonial officers that would develop the British Empire. It would train the missionaries that went out to bring the Bible around the world, and so on. So that by the end of the 19th century, the voice of Britain, perceived from abroad, was almost always received pronunciation. It was very unusual for somebody in some other country to hear an accent other than that, at least in the British Empire influence sphere of things. If it was an American colony or something, of course, you'd hear American pronunciation. Now, this continued into the 20th century. So when the BBC began in the 1920s, for instance, the man who invented the BBC, who was a Scotsman, strong Scots accent, said, no, we don't want my sort of accent on the radio. That won't be understood by a lot of people. We need the accent of the southeast of England, the prestige accent, RP. And so the BBC adopted it. And for many decades, the only accent you would hear on the BBC was received pronunciation. Now, when English language teaching began to develop in the early 20th century, and English slowly became the kind of international language, and now the global language that it is, obviously the teachers involved would adopt RP as the only sensible accent to present to their learners. After all, the teachers themselves almost all spoke RP anyway. So the materials that they were using were based on RP. The examining boards, of course, were expecting it to be RP, and it became the norm for English language teaching. Now, things began to change in the 1960s, more or less, 1960s, 1970s. It's difficult to put a date on it, but slowly there became a recognition that other accents, the RP was such a minority accent that it was absurd to omit the other accents from consideration. The BBC was one of the first to recognize this. In the 1970s, a gentleman called Annan, Lord Annan, a peer, was asked to write a report to the BBC about how the BBC was doing, called the Annan Report. That's A-N-N-A-N, the Annan Report.
All right.
And in it, he says, the BBC needs to recognize more regional accents. The BBC needs to become more diverse. Why?
Why?
Why? Because the 1960s was the decade when local radio stations came into being, commercial radio. So there were now many radio stations around the country. There was a radio station in Wales, radio station in Liverpool, one in Birmingham, one in Edinburgh, and so on. And these local radio stations, their announcers were using their local accents, of course, and they were picking up listeners. Now, the national BBC had to keep pace with this. Otherwise, it would lose all its listeners to these local radio stations. Mm-hmm. And so that was one of the most important factors which led the BBC to say, we must have more regional accents. And slowly, if you listen to the BBC today, now 40, 50 years on, you will hear a wide range of intelligible regional accents, as well as some RP. Of course, the RP is still there.
In order to reach more listeners.
Yes. I see. Yeah, precisely. Remember that accent is essentially a matter of identity. It shows who you are and where you are from and who you belong with and who you don't belong with. And so if you are a national organization wanting to appeal to everybody, bearing in mind that RP, and now the current figure, RP is spoken by only 2% of the population of England, then if everything is in RP, most of your listeners are going to say, that's not my accent. That's nothing to do with me. Why aren't you talking to me in the way I like to hear English? And the BBC responded to that. Mm-hmm. And of course, other organizations as well. It's not just the BBC. And increasingly, we now hear diversity of accents in these public events. So that was part of the history of it. Now, the other side is what actually happened to RP itself. You see, all accents change over time. No accent stays the same. No language stays the same. The language and pronunciation that you heard in English 100 years ago is different from today. Shakespeare's time, different again. It always changes. And in the 20th century, we have heard innumerable changes in grammar, of course, vocabulary as well, but in pronunciation too. So when you listen to RP as it was spoken on the radio in the 1920s and 30s, and there are many recordings available, it sounds very different from the RP that we hear today. So RP itself has changed.
Could you give us some examples?
Yes, sure. If you go back to the 1910 period, Daniel Jones, the great English phonetician, described RP in those days. So take a word like Lord, L-O-R-D. In present day RP, it would be Lord, Lord, law with an O sound.
Yes.
In the 1910s, it was lard, lard, lard with an R sound. People talk about the accent being very far back, meaning far back in the mouth, or versus R, you see. Now that's the sort of thing. Now that's a dramatic difference.
It is.
If you now take, if you take the last 30 or 40 years, and we take Her Majesty the Queen as the perfect example of this, because her accent has been minutely studied over her reign. And you listen to the speeches from the throne she made in the 1950s, compared with the speeches from the throne she makes today, and you will hear many differences. And here are a couple of examples. 50 years ago, she would have said the word man, M-A-N, with a very front vowel, man, 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 an eh sound almost. Do you hear it? Man, man, yes. Man.
Like the today, plural of man.
Almost like the plural, yes. Today, it's more man, man, man with an ah sound. Another example, 50 years ago, a word like cup, C-U-P, would have been a very open sound, cup, cup, with an ah sound. Today, it's more cup, cup, with an sound. Do you hear the difference?
Yes.
It's not that great, but it's very noticeable. Now, RP is always changing, therefore. And so if you're dealing with a model of RP that was based 40 or 50 years ago, as I'm afraid many textbook courses and so on still are, it sounds very dated to modern English ears. Now we're talking about the Queen there. Go down a generation or two to her grandchildren who have been in the forces and who are much more down to earth. And of course now to the majority of people who are educated, prestige speakers in the country. People, I guess, like myself. I'm a professor, I'm well known, but I don't speak RP. What do I speak? What are you listening to now? You're listening to my regional background, brought up in Wales for 10 years in Liverpool, 20 years indeed in the south of England. Now I'm back in Wales. All these different areas have influenced my accent, which is a mix. There are some features of RP in it. There are some regional features in it. I don't say cup, I say cup with an sound. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I say a long vowel in a word like bath. Sometimes I say a short vowel and say bath. I never know which it's going to be. My accent is a very mixed accent. For example, or is it for example? I use both because of my mixed accent background. Now, the majority of people in England are either regional background purely, that is, they've lived all their lives in one place, or more likely, they have moved all over the place. So most accents that you hear in Britain today, apart from in certain restricted areas like in Wales and in Scotland, where the accent is likely to be more localized, they are mixed accents. They are a mixture of the RP that they will have heard on the news and everywhere else, and that perhaps they learned when they were in school, and also their local regional accent. Now, these mixed accents are so normal now.
So you just mentioned it's just 2% of the total population that talks RP. So is there a dominant accent?
In Britain, not really. You go around Britain and an accent changes every 25 miles or so on average. So if I travel from here to London, I will hear half a dozen different accents on the way down, reflecting the different parts of the country. Now, the one thing that has happened in recent times is that the accent of Southeast England, the RP that was there, has itself been modified by the other accents that were spoken around London. And this has led to a phenomenon that you may have come across called estuary English. The estuary is the River Thames, and the counties around the River Thames, counties like Essex and Hertfordshire and Kent, these had a kind of more down market sort of accent. Now, why? Because after the Second World War, the Cockneys, those with a really strong London accent, you know, the old Cockneys of the old days, those people who speak like that, they moved out into these home counties. And as they moved out, so their accent shifted and took up some of the characteristics of the home counties. At the same time, people from the home counties came into London to work and from further afield. And so their accents picked up some of the Cockney qualities. You see, so there was a kind of mix because of commuting in and out, and people moving out of London, people moving into London. So during the 1950s and 60s, we get the growth of these mixed accents, and the estuary English is the one that has slowly begun to spread around the country. You ask if it's a dominant accent? Well, no, not really, but its influence has been dominant. So if you now go to the north of England, say, or even into Scotland, you will hear, thanks to radio and television and the internet, some features of that South accent affecting Northern English, Lancashire English, Scottish English, Welsh English, and so on. Now, what sort of features am I talking about? Talking about things like using the glottal stop. Now, what is a glottal stop? A glottal stop is a little catch, like that. And in speech, it comes out as a very clicky kind of sound. So if I say, listen, it's very hot today, and I say hot, as the Queen would say it, hot with a t at the end, or listen carefully, it's very hot, hot, yeah. Hot, hot. You hear the difference? Yeah. Hot versus hot. Now that hot, that little stop at the end there is a glottal stop.
Yeah.
Now, traditionally in RP, that would not have been heard. Today, in these mixed accents, you will hear it increasingly. Another example, the TH sound, which so many foreigners find difficult to pronounce, as in thin and heath and so on. Where are we going? Where's the plane going to? It's going to Heathrow, Heathrow. Awful lot of people in England can't pronounce that. And Cockneys certainly wouldn't. Cockneys would say Heathrow, Heath, Heath, with an F instead of the TH, right? Now that pronunciation has spread enormously, so that people all over the country now would be saying things like Heathrow, Heathrow with an F rather than a TH. So these are some of the features of Cockney and indeed other local dialect, other local accents that have begun to spread around the country. But they haven't replaced local accents in other parts of the country. They have mixed with them. So I used to live in Liverpool, as you know. And in Liverpool, they have a very strong regional accent. It's called Scouse, the Liverpool accent. Think of the Beatles, right? Very strong Liverpool accent. All right, you know, this is the sort of thing you hear in Liverpool. It's this sort of accent, all right? It's like this, a very strong accent. Now, in Liverpool today, you will still hear that accent, but you will also hear it mixed with a much more, as it were, educated form. You'll also hear it mixed with immigrant accents. So you'll hear a Chinese version of that, or an Italian version of that, or a Jamaican version of that, because of the huge number of immigrants that have come into the country in recent decades. So the story I'm telling you, Timon, is that English accents are increasingly mixed these days. And while it is still the case that over the English-speaking world, those influenced by British English are still predominantly teaching a sort of RP. I'll come back to that in a moment. The kind of English you will hear on the streets and the kind of English you need to expose your students to are these mixed kinds of accents. If your students end up believing that the only kind of accent they will hear on the streets of London is RP, they have got a horrible shock coming, because 99% of the people they have to listen to will not be speaking RP. Therefore, in listening comprehension terms, any teacher needs to expose students to as wide a variety of accents as possible in order to make it real for them. Now, if they're going to carry on teaching RP, fine. There's nothing wrong with RP, so long as you remember that RP itself is changing, and changing in all these different directions. If you want an educated accent, then why not copy me or copy most of the teachers of English in the world these days? I go to the IATEFL conference, the International Association of Teachers of English as a Foreign Language, every year, or at least I used to before the pandemic. And I listen to all the English teachers there. A few of them speak RP. Most of them have a mixed accent.
Yes.
Some of the best English teachers in Britain have a Scottish accent, or an Irish accent, or a Welsh accent, or a Yorkshire accent, or a modified version of these accents. That's the point, a modified version. And if you want academic evidence recognizing the fact that RP in its traditional form is now seen to be so traditional and elitist and out of date, all you have to do is go to one of the biggest textbooks on the teaching of English pronunciation. Many of the people listening to this will have studied it. It is by a man called Gimson. A.C. Gimson, and the book is called An Introduction to the Pronunciation of English. And if you've ever studied phonetics, you will have encountered that book. Now it's in its 6th or is it the 7th edition? I forget now, many editions. In the latest edition, in the first editions, it was all about RP. In the latest edition, they have stopped using the term RP. They don't use it anymore. And now they talk about general English, general English.
Just like general American. General
exactly like that. Yeah, exactly like general American. Because there is no such thing as an RP kind of American accent. You know, there is no such thing. American English is very diverse. There are lots of accents in American English, but there is a kind of homogeneous sort of American English that most people encounter, and that's called general American. Well, similarly, if I go to an academic conference now today, well, if I could, if pandemic allowed me, I would hear there a room full of people all speaking in an educated way, reflecting their regional backgrounds. Some will be more RP than others. There'll be the influence of traditional RP on many of them, but not on all of them. And so slowly, and of course, some of them, to go back to your original point, will show the influence of American English pronunciation. Now, let me just amplify that for a second. I have, at the beginning of our little interview, you saw Ben, my son Ben,
yes,
who is age 44. He speaks, he has been brought up in this country. I say the word schedule, meaning my timetable. He says it schedule.
It's the American to me, yes.
The American pronunciation. So when I'm talking to him, I often say schedule as well, because we're talking together, we're accommodating to each other's style. Now, his generation universally says schedule. And there are so many other examples like this, where American pronunciation has influenced British pronunciation, not the other way around. There are hardly any examples of the opposite taking place. So as a result, not just in listening, which is what you mentioned at the beginning of our chat, where people will hear American pronunciation on the radio, television, and so on, and on the internet and video games, etc., etc. No, many of these young people in Britain now, 100% British, have begun to use American pronunciations in their speech. And slowly, this is going up the age range, slowly. You won't hear much evidence.
You mean the use of GA, General American, in English language?
Yeah, certain features of it is going up the age range. Like the schedule example, and lots of, take stress shift, you know, are we going to do research or are we going to do research?
Yeah.
You know, that kind of thing.
Military, military.
Yeah, the American, exactly, and secretary and all of those. The American pronunciation is slowly influencing the British one. And it's noticeable amongst the younger people. Well, of course, the younger people are not yet in a position of power on the radio and things. So you won't hear it so much on the radio, but in 50 years' time, when the young people have grown up and have become part of the authorities, then you're going to hear those accents much more dominantly than you do today. So when you're looking at the question of teaching, you have to be realistic. You mentioned the examining boards, the assessment authorities.
Yes.
They are the slowest to change, Inevitably, they are conservative by nature. They look back. And I've spoken to several of the examining authorities in Britain, and gradually over the last 10, 15 years, they have begun to recognize the realities of present day English and are becoming more tolerant, accepting regional variations as long as they're still intelligible, right? Now, that's a very important point.
Intelligible.
Nobody is suggesting for one moment that broad regional accents should be taught, because they are sometimes very difficult to understand. No, we're talking about this, what's called modified RP, regionally influenced RP, where it's still broadly similar to the way everybody else speaks who's has an educated background. But nonetheless, there are these local features in it that make it diverse. And that's the kind of English that is becoming increasingly accepted by the examining boards. I've heard examiners say, I'm very happy to hear a student from abroad speak in a Scottish kind of way, so long as it's, you know, an educated Scots accent. Why has he learnt that? Because he was taught English by an English teacher from Scotland. You know, that's the sort of background. And if the people have got an English teacher from America, then why not have an American kind of accent as part of your background? Remember, it's all about identity.
It is, but don't you think there are certain situations in which the accent works is a benefit for you? RP and as a politician, maybe it's more important to express yourself in RP than in Scottish. Is there still such a thing as favorable accent?
Yeah. Yeah, accentism, as it's sometimes called. Accentism.
For example, when you're applying for a job and you speak RP as opposed to Jamaican English, I'm sure that influences the outcome of your job application.
Unfortunately, there is still some of this around. Far less than there was a generation ago. The movement towards diversity, cultural diversity, ethnic diversity, gender diversity, and all of these things which are part of the present day is slowly eroding that kind of attitude. But it is still there. You have to be cautious. That's why I say, when you're deciding what sort of accent to teach your students, you have to bear in mind the kinds of audiences that are going to judge their accent. First, the examining boards. And if you know that the examining boards are notoriously conservative, then I'm afraid you have to bite that bullet. You have two alternatives: change the examining board or help the students, as it were, meet the needs of the examining board. But there's no harm in doing that, as long as you also teach the students the other kinds of accents that they're likely to encounter when they meet the real world outside of the examining board situation. Now, same point applies to applying for a job and all the rest of it. Yes, I'm afraid there are still some organizations that would rate RP so highly that they would dismiss you, would not even consider you if they knew you spoke in that way. I would say, and this is purely a very general impression, I would say about 5% of the companies in Britain probably still have that kind of attitude. But the vast majority do not, in my experience. They do not. And the important thing to appreciate here is that this sort of diversity is reflected in, I mean, what's the evidence, you might say? Well, here's the evidence. These companies put advertisements on the television, advertising themselves. Do an analysis of the commercial ads that are on ITV and all the other commercial channels. This has been done. You now never say never, but you hardly ever hear RP in a commercial advertisement these days. Hardly ever. I would almost say never. Son Ben, that you glimpsed at the beginning, is an actor. And he and I wrote a book a few years ago called You Say Potato. It's called a book about accents because of the old song, you know, you say potato and I say potato and all of that.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. He has a voice agent who gives him work as voiceovers. In the book, we reproduce an interview with his voice agent. The voice agent says to him, Ben, she says, I never get asked for RP these days. Never. If you want a voiceover job advertising some commercial product, then you need to speak in a local kind of way. You need to speak in a down market London way or a Yorkshire way or whatever it happens to be. And that's absolutely right. RP is out. as far as the commercial world is concerned. And therefore you might expect, and this is my point, that if you went for a job in one of those companies, they would be far more likely to appoint you if your accent was, and this is the term, customer friendly, rather than elitist. And that's the argument, I think.
Customer friendly. Well, that's interesting. So that means it applies to a broad array of people, customer friendly.
Yeah. See, there have been a lot of studies done on accent attitudes. This is the sort of thing that goes on. Some of your listeners and viewers may have come across this. You get an actor to say a sentence in as many different accents as he can do. So he says it in an RP way, in a Scottish way, in an Irish way, and so on. And then you play this recording to people and you say, based only on the sentence that you have heard, how do you rate the speaker? Is the speaker intelligent? Is the speaker beautiful? Is the speaker a criminal? Is the speaker, and all the rest of it. And a huge range of, and you think it can't be done. You've only got one cent. No, people will make judgments straight away. And here's the point. The judgments have shifted dramatically in the last 30 years. 30 years ago, RP would get all the positive values. RP, if you heard the RP speaker, of course the speaker is intelligent. Of course the speaker is not a criminal. Of course the speaker is beautiful, and so on. A Cockney accent from London would have the opposite. The speaker cannot be trusted.
Yes.
The speaker is not intelligent. Here's an example. We're 30 years ago now, okay? And I say to you, hello, I've got a second-hand car. Would you like to buy my car? It's a lovely car. And you say, of course. You sound lovely. I mean, you must be honest.
Yeah.
30 years ago, if I said to you, hello, I've got a second-hand car. Would you like to buy my car? It's a lovely car. 30 years ago, people have said, oh, no, he sounds very suspicious, that fellow. Today, it's reversed.
Really?
Reversed. Hello, I've got a second-hand car, Mr. Bond. Don't you think, Mr. Bond? Are we not a nice, honest person here? Mm?
Really?
All the Hollywood bad guys speak RP, don't they? In Bond films and the like.
Yeah,
well, you know,
about it, way. Really?
You know, no, RP is getting a bad reaction now. Whereas, hello, I've got a new car, a second-hand car. Would you like to buy it? Well, you sound a nice, honest, down-to-earth guy because you speak like me and I speak like you and you're customer friendly, you see. The attitudes have changed and that's the most significant thing. So anybody speaking RP is going to sound posh these days.
Yes.
So here's the thing for your students and everybody. Do you want to sound posh? If your answer is yes, I do, then carry on speaking RP. But if the answer is no, I don't,
no,
then develop a regional accent. Or, and here's the clincher, keep the local accent that you have. Keep your Dutch accent. It's a beautiful accent, a Dutch-influenced English. A French accent is a beautiful accent, a French-influenced English. A Spanish-influenced accent is beautiful.
Yes.
It's a garden of linguistic flowers. Yes. I go into my garden here. If it was all one flower all the way around, it would be so boring. The more different kinds of flowers there are, the more I like the garden. It's the same with accents. If everybody speaks in the same kind of way, it's a deadly dull linguistic world. No, let's have as many variations of accent as possible so that when I'm talking to people and listening to them, I can sense where they are from. And this adds to the beauty and diversity of the linguistic world. So don't ever think, I mean, this is again radical compared with 30 years ago. Don't ever think you need to have a native speaking accent. Why would anybody from the Netherlands want to have a English accent?
Nobody wants to. Well, not my students, at least. They speak American English. The thing is, when students are assessed, most of the time it's in RP. Not only in the Netherlands, but I'm sure it's the same in India. And it's just, I mean, Indian people are not assessed in Indian English, are they?
No, they're not. There are some countries where indeed the tradition is so strong that RP is the only kind of accent people will tolerate. You've mentioned India, although things are changing there. Russia is another good example. I've often been to Moscow and parts of Russia and spoken to the examiners and so on there. RP is still very, very strong there, but it's such an old-fashioned kind of RP. It's an RP that you just don't hear anymore. I was in Argentina once, and I heard accents in the country club in Buenos Aires that died out in England 30 years ago or more, and they're still being spoken out there. So RP is still around with influence in many parts of the world.
But what you're saying here is that there are different RPs around the globe. There's a different RP in Russia than here in the Netherlands, for example.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So
I mean, you will find this. I mean, assessment boards will take a long time to change. So will teachers. After all, if I were a teacher, I'm not, thank goodness, I have an easy job as a linguist. But if I were a teacher, I would want to teach the accent that I was taught myself and I know well, that the teaching materials have available in the textbooks and so on, and that I know the examining boards are expecting. It takes a long time for new materials to evolve, examining boards to change their attitude, and teachers to become familiar with the new materials. Now, 20 years ago, there were no new materials. These days, they're everywhere. You can now easy to get recordings now of the kind of English that I've been talking about, these mixed accents. There is this wonderful center in America called IDEA, the International Dialects of English Archive, IDEA, IDEA, which collects accents from all over the English-speaking world and presents them. And of course, there are now a number of teaching courses where RP is no longer the only kind of accent that is there. Let's not overestimate the differences between RP and other accents. Remember that most of the consonants of RP are the same as in the consonants of regional accents. It's just some of the vowels, and not all of the vowels either. And you can easily develop, well, I say easily, people who do this sort of thing routinely can do it easily. I would find it difficult to develop a course where, as you teach a particular sound, you teach some of the variations of it as well. So one says, all right, there is for example, you'll use the long A in RP, example, but an awful lot of people in Britain will say example, and in America they say example, and so on. Let's try those three together. Example, 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 and get familiar with them all. And so you can switch between them. But when you're going for your examination, use the first one, all right? That kind of approach is likely to be much more fruitful until such time as the examining boards make a statement saying, and this has already happened in some countries, American English accents are perfectly acceptable. I know the British Council, for instance, in many parts of the world, they have lots of assessment centers. They're much more tolerant of American English accents now than they were 20 years ago.
Well, you talk about accents as a form of identity. And of course, when America became independent from England, it was a perfect way of showing that they were unique, different from England. But nowadays, the internet has created a global generation. How do you see the future of English? Is there going to be a global English since the American language is integrated so much in the RP, for example. What's the future?
That all questions about the future depend entirely on, basically come down to questions about the future of the world, about political power, economic power, and all the rest of it. So whether American English will continue to dominate English will depend upon whether America retains its position. You can easily imagine a situation where a Chinese type of accent becomes the elite cultural accent to acquire. Another scenario, an Arabic type of accent might be the one to acquire, and so on. At the moment, the American English, because of its dominance on television and so on, seems to be still exercising the kind of influence it always has had. So I don't see any immediate change taking place there. But already we are seeing the influence of other accents of English unpredictably, really. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if you go to London now, to the East End of London, you will hear there a kind of accent amongst young people that is directly the influence of the Caribbean. And it's coming through rap and hip hop and all the rest of it. And not just the Caribbean, but from Indian English as well. You mentioned a few minutes ago that RP is spoken in India. Yes, but with a very Indian rhythm, usually. You know, the consequences of what I am saying, you know, that rat-tat-tat-tat kind of effect. Yeah, very common. It's the difference technically is called a syllable timed English versus a stress timed English. The stress timed English I'm using now, ti-tum, 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 ti-tum.
Yes.
A syllable timed English is rat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat. Now, when you think about Caribbean English, somebody from Jamaica doesn't say, you know, I'm from Jamaica. They say, I'm from Jamaica, you know, rat-tat-tat-tat. Now, that kind of syllable timed English has become very much the normal thing amongst young people in not just London, but it's very noticeable there. It's called multicultural London English.
How come?
And you'll hear it. You know, a Cockney from London, a young Cockney lad, would traditionally say, me and my mates, we're going to go out in the garage tonight. Me and my mates, we're going to go down to the garage tonight. Me and my mates, we're going to go down to the garage tonight. Now they will say something more like this. Me and my mates, we are going down to the garage tonight. Rat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat. Do you hear the difference? It's still pretty Cockney in its consonants and vowels, but the rhythm is now much more rat-tat-tat rather than tum-ti-tum-ti-tum. So, because of the influence of rap, hip hop, and all the rest of it, and rap is very largely a rat-tat-tat sort of thing, isn't it? Okay, now we're gonna do a new rap, and I'm gonna do rap without any of the crap, and I'm talking to you now with an intonation that is like English revelation, you know. I mean, whatever. It's rat-tat-tat-tat-tat all the time. That kind of English is likely to become increasingly common in British English contexts and American too. And this is good news for many foreign learners of English who speak in a syllable timed way anyway. You see, that's their norm. So, you know, people who are continually speaking syllable time will suddenly realize that actually they can relax a bit when they start speaking English and not necessarily change as much as they used to have to do.
Yeah. Well, that's very interesting. You know, I have a David Crystal bookshelf here in my house. So many books. Your output is huge. And before,
well done.
Before we finish, you know, I just like to talk about two books I really like. I think they're your latest output.
Yes. Oh, you've got the little novella.
Yeah, well, it was really. You know, it's the first book where I had to go back time after time just to crack the damn code. I'm still struggling because
I'm very glad to hear that. Very glad to hear that.
Yes, well, normally I read a novel and I start at page 1 and I finish a couple of hours later. And now it was just damn what I was going back all the time, and at times really frustrating because I'm still trying to figure out the code on the last few pages. So,
good. I'm very glad to have caused you that sort of pain. Very, very glad. No, it's an interesting book. I mean, one of my aims in life was always to try and write something in every genre. And I'd done almost all of them, you know, on the academic side. And on the creative side, I'd done poetry, I'd done plays, but I'd never written a novel. And so I thought, with lockdown a couple of years ago, I thought, well, I'll have a go now and see how I get on. And it was never a novel, it was a novella. I mean, it's quite a small little thing, but at least I enjoyed you know, the experience of doing it. I'm glad you liked it.
Well, there was a reason. I've seen many of your podcasts, especially Luke's English podcast I really like. And you talked about the reason why you never wrote a novella, because you wrote plays. And when people read novels, they want to read about the appearance of some character or other characteristics which are irrelevant in plays.
Yeah, exactly right. Well remembered, because that's exactly my thinking. Why do I have to describe somebody? What a bore that is. Because, you know, Dickens is the perfect example. His character descriptions are wonderful.
He's a word painter, just like the novel Jane Eyre. It's just the same. Same
all of those 19th century novelists, they were so good at character description.
Yeah.
So, yeah. I'm still not very good at it. I did the best I could with the characters in that particular story, but it doesn't come naturally to me. I'm not a born novelist. I shan't do another one, I don't think.
Yes, I can. That's a fixed. People will call it a fixed mindset. And Professor Carol Dweck would say, "Yet you always have to add yet at the end of the sentence. I'm not a good novelist yet." Which I disagree with, because it was really, I really continued reading because I really want to know how you made the Russian Republic, you know, break up. I mean, I mean, the first sentence, it's hilarious. I'm responsible for the final breakup of the Soviet Union. I mean, that's a teaser. You know what? The other thing I like about the book is the Welsh life, which is so present. For example, I really like the two idioms. I think they're especially Hollyhead idioms, like no mountain today, or the mountain's got its head on, and you know what I mean. And I'm sure that many people from Hollyhead know what you mean when you say the mountain got its hat on. For most people, it's totally, you know, it's a riddle.
Always at the peak of the mountain, always there's mist there, at least on certain days.
Yes.
And if there's mist there, it means it's just been raining or it's just about to rain, one or the other.
Yeah. So it's really nice to see how these idioms come to be in local accent. So I liked it, and I'm still working on it, because I haven't cracked all the code yet. But are you planning on writing another one?
Well, not at the moment. It's not out of the question, but you know, I want to wait and see how that one goes first.
Have you gotten any feedback yet?
Well, on the Amazon site, there are a number of people who have said some nice things about it, but it's not been out very long, and I'll just wait and see. Really, it'd be nice. It's great fun writing creatively, isn't it?
So your next novel is dependent on the feedback you're getting from the Amazon site. So
well, I suppose so. I mean, that's like academic life as well. Your next academic book is going to depend on the feedback you've had about the previous one.
I see, yeah. And the other thing I like is it really gives you an insight in the laborious way of creating an encyclopedia, the process of writing such an enormous piece of...
yeah, well, now it wasn't that encyclopedia that I was referring to in the novel. You probably won't have the
No, no,
encyclopedias there.
this
You've
one.
got the language ones.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, in the novel, I'm referring to the big general encyclopedia called the Cambridge Encyclopedia,
Yeah.
which these days nobody would ever know about because we've got Google and Wikipedia and everything. But in those days, hard copy encyclopedias that thick, huge volumes, would be on everybody's shelves, like big dictionaries, really.
Yeah.
And it's one of those that is the basis of the codes that I'm referring to. In fact, if you look carefully at the picture on the front, the book, of the novel.
Oh, all right. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
book,
Holly hat in the background, I suppose.
Yes, that's right. And the book in front of the computer is the Cambridge Encyclopedia, you see, not the language ones you're just holding up. Mm-hmm. And that's the book from which the codes were generated. And I'll tell you, there are geeks out there who are checking every one of my references to that encyclopedia.
Oh,
they've got hold of an old copy and they're making sure it's right.
Really? Are those inmates or something?
I think they probably are.
Wow, that's amazing. So you're not working on a new novel currently. What are you working on currently? What's your next
project? At the moment, I'm spending quite a lot of time developing on the online sites that I'm involved in. There are two mainly. The Shakespeare's Words site, which is a glossary and language companion to all of Shakespeare's words, the difficult ones, I mean, that I do with Ben. And every year we do something new in relation to that. And that takes quite a lot of work. And the other thing is the site called originalpronunciation.com. And original pronunciation is the reconstruction of the accents of English in earlier periods. And it began with Shakespeare, you see, how people wanted to know, how did Shakespeare sound on the stage in 1600? Now, it's possible to work that out. And the OP website illustrates the accents, notice plural, of the time of Shakespeare's time. And that's been up now for several years. Now, slowly people have said, well, what about other periods of English? What about Old English? What about Middle English? And so at the moment, I'm working on a new section of that website in which Old English will be part of the website. Beowulf and all the great poems of Old English times. Yep. I'll record several of those. In fact, I've already done the recording, but the site isn't ready yet. So that's what's taking up all the time at the moment.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Yeah. So I have a couple of more questions. The penultimate, I suppose, is: do you have any unanswered research questions about linguistics?
Oh, more than there's time for you and I to talk about. Oh, yeah, sure. Because remember, linguistics is a general subject. I've been specializing in English, but linguistics is the study of all the languages of the world, all 6,000 plus of them.
Yes.
Only 2,000 or 3,000 of them have been studied. So there's, a host of new languages waiting to be studied, and I'd love to have several lifetimes in order to study all of them, especially the endangered languages of the world. Half the world's languages are so seriously endangered that they're likely to die out in the course of the present century. Yes. In which case, it's very important to document these as soon as possible, and if possible, revitalize them, but certainly document them. And so there's an awful lot of question marks hanging over, what to be done there.
Why is it so important?
Because a language shows us what it is to be human. English shows one vision of the world. Dutch shows a different vision of the world in its cultural background, in its idioms and all the rest of it, and its history, of course, and its literature. And there are something like 6,000 visions of the world out there. Add them all together and you get a good picture of the human race and how it thinks about things. Now, There's one vision of the world dying out every 3 months on average at the moment. We'll never know how those people saw what it was to be human. And the more we can capture those visions before they disappear, the better, it seems to me.
Zurich University published a report last week, actually, stating that a third of the languages are going extinct in the next couple of decades. So how did you read that report?
I haven't read that one, but that ties in exactly with the general reports I've read from earlier times, which suggest a language dying out every 3 or 4 months or so on average.
And their main concern, or the main concern mentioned in the report, is the medical knowledge, especially plant knowledge of some local people in the Amazon, for example. And I mean, the use of antibiotics is finite. And in the end, we are dependent on different kinds of medicine. And especially those few languages in the Amazons are really, might really be important for human survival.
Yeah, already have been. And not just the Amazon, but any endangered language, Aboriginal languages in Australia and many others have already demonstrated knowledge that has affected, now not just medicine, though that is a big area, but land management, the ecological balance of our planet, and so many of the insights that are important that the West has really not yet come to terms with can be found in these local cultures all over the world. So the more we can get that kind of information out of these languages before their last speakers die, the better. So that's the sort of background indeed. Yeah, there are lots and lots of questions there that I'd love to know the answers to. But even if we stick just to English, I mean, the beauty of a language is that it changes for me. Whatever English was like yesterday, it is different today. It will be different tomorrow. So what's tomorrow going to bring? I have no idea. That's what I want to know. And if you think now about the unpredictability of language, just think back over the last 5 years. Who would have imagined 5 years ago that in English today, as in some other languages, one of the most productive new suffixes would be exit.
Of course.
Brexit, Dexit, Grexit, Frexit, Sexit, Mexit, and so on. Who could have predicted that? Who would have predicted 18 months ago that in the next 18 months, we would be using words like social distancing, lockdown, and then playing with these words? Quarantine, quarantini, the drink you have at the end of the day. Quarantitotal, if you don't have a drink at the end of the day. Quaranteenager, the awful thought of a teenager living at home with nowhere else to go. Now, all this is unpredictable and part of the beauty of language development. And that's what keeps me going.
Excellent. Well, my last question is, I'm a musician by trade. I studied flamenco guitar at the Rotterdam Conservatory. Actually, I'm one of the very few people in the world actually with an official flamenco guitar degree. It's totally useless, but it was really fun to do. Talking about extinct music. Yeah. So I'm always asking my interviewees at the end of the interview, if you have to name or mention 3 musical pieces or compositions that are really dear to you, what would your top 3 be like?
Top 3. Well, at the moment, these change as time goes by. At the moment, I would answer that by saying, what do we listen to most in the evening here at home? And I suppose number 1 is Philip Glass.
Beautiful.
In all his variety.
The piano in the movie is beautiful.
Oh, everything.
Yeah.
Number 2 is the choral music that comes from the 17th and 18th century from South America. There is a choir in Britain called Ex Cathedra, and they specialize in singing 18th century music of all kinds, but especially from Central and South America. And at the moment, we listen to that probably more than anything else.
How is that different from European choir music?
Well, when you listen to it, you think, hey, hang on, that's Mozart, isn't it? Hey, wait a minute, isn't that Bach? And you suddenly realize that these are people out there who either anticipated later developments or were influenced by earlier developments, but it was a completely unique form of musical development out there. It sounds completely fresh to me. So there is that. And you asked for three. Oh, the third one is always very, very difficult. Very difficult. Depends on the. We listen to quite a lot of jazz too. Actually, I have a background in jazz myself, and indeed, used to play in a band once.
Really? What instrument?
Saxophone, alto sax.
Ah, of course.
In fact, I was a member. I mean, this goes back to the 1950s now, which is the rock and roll era. And I was the first clarinet in the school orchestra. And it was the era, this is 1957, and Bill Haley and the Comets had just made Rock Around the Clock.
Yeah.
So all over Liverpool, hundreds of school kids got together to try and be a new Bill Haley and the Comets. And the most famous ones, of course, later became the Beatles and things of that sort. Well, in 1957, myself and a group formed a group called the Zodiacs, and we played rock and roll. And we were the only group in Liverpool at the time to have an alto sax player, because the saxophone and the clarinet have very similar fingerings. And we lasted for 2 years. And then I went to university, and others did, and the group broke up. But not all the members broke up. One of the members, the drummer, a chap called Dave Lovelady, he stayed on in the business, joined other pop groups of the time, eventually became the drummer of a group called The Foremost that had a #1 hit a few years later. So he joined the business. I didn't. I became a linguist. If I'd stayed in the pop world, I think I might have become famous by now.
You might have. Do you still own a saxophone?
Oh yeah, I've still got it upstairs. Haven't played it for ages.
You haven't played it for ages. You only own a saxophone, but you don't play it.
Oh, I've got a clarinet as well. I mean, there are two problems. One, I don't have anybody to play with. And two, as you get older,
yeah, you need a lot of strength in
the mouth becomes a lot weaker. And last time I tried it, I wasn't able to play for long before my mouth went like that, and I had to stop. Yeah, so I'm out of the nightclubs now, I'm afraid.
I see. Well, those were all my questions. Professor, thanks a lot for your time and your stories, and for discussing your book and elaborating about your musical style, and explaining the most important question about RP versus other kinds of Englishes. It was really fun to talk to you. It was an honor talking to you.
Well, it's been a real pleasure. Thanks for your interest. All power to you for the variety of things that you do, and I hope this podcast will be appreciated by you, and everything will go fine. So all power to you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you too. Bye bye, Professor Christian.
Bye bye now.